Thank you very much, Professor. I'm very honored to be here in the UNICEF house. UNICEF is one of the stars of the constellation of the United Nations organizations. It's a respected organization and an organization that is fully involved in operational activities across the planet. So it is an honor for us to be here. Indeed, as Professor Alam Ahmed said, yes, we in the United Nations, we approved at the highest possible political level the Agenda for Sustainable Development. And for the first time in the history of the United Nations, we proposed a different paradigm on that contribution of the United Nations. If we see things in the historical perspective, I would say anecdotically that it's a long way to go. In the 50s, the very notion of development economics did not exist in the UN system. We were talking about economic growth in technical quantitative terms. The development economy did not exist. It was the first probably merit of the United Nations that introduced in the vocabulary of international politics the economics of development. And then in the 60s, this idea of development decades were launched in the United Nations, and very few people remember that actually that was an American proposal. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy launched that in the United Nations. It sounds a little bit interesting now that we know how the moods are changing in relation to the United Nations. But basically, those were the decades when the United Nations actually launched the idea that there should be an effort by the international community, the United Nations, in service of the developing countries. And the notion of official assistance for development was part of that thinking. Of course, after some years, the respective decades were called the lost decades for development, which was probably partly true. And then the world development concept made its way, and with the emergence of global summits, world summits after the end of the Cold War, we put together an agenda that is the agenda of mankind, not agenda of various groups of countries. The Millennium Development Goals were a collection of separate goals that put together made a coherent corpus. And what is important about that MDG is the fact that it was for the first time that the United Nations proposed to the humankind a sort of programmatic agenda for development with targets, with indicators. It was for the first time when the general political discourse turned into a programmatic agenda. And now we have the Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is no longer a collection of goals. It is a coherent corpus of integrated, holistic goals, and none of the goals can be achieved in itself. And one of the most important features of this agenda is that none of the goals can be achieved by individual protagonists only, by member states only. They should be achieved with the participation of all global players, including and in particular, we'd say at this point in time, the private sector. It is obvious that with the advance of liberalism in the world and the increasing role of the private sector and the less regulation, one cannot conceive a real advance in development without a more important contribution of the private sector. So starting from this assumption, the Joint Inspection Unit started a review on the private sector, the United Nations private sector partnership arrangements with the actually the explicit goal to make the United Nations system more user-friendly for the private sector, in the sense that for many of the dynamic private sector global players, the United Nations is too bureaucratic, it's moving too slowly, there are operational incompatibilities, there are financial rules that do not work very efficiently in relation to the private sector. On the other hand, for the United Nations cannot engage into any sort of activity with private companies that do violate human rights, do violate norms of environmental protection, that are involved in trafficking, in money laundering, in drugs, in trade, arms trade, etc., etc. So the Joint Inspection Unit undertook this review with the purpose of doing something to bring closer the United Nations system and the private sector and the businesses in general. And now I think probably the few of us know what is the Joint Inspection Unit. The Joint Inspection Unit is an oversight, independent, system-wide body. So when I said this line, I should emphasize that one thing is independence, in the sense that we do not report to any of the leaders of the United Nations organizations, and we are working with 28 organizations. Almost everything that we've heard about the funds and programs of the United Nations, including, for instance, UNICEF, UNDP, but also the specialized agencies, the FAO, the International Atomic Energy, the International Telecommunication Unit, etc., etc. So we are working with 28 organizations, so we are independent. We also have this system-wide competence. We are the only oversight body with such a system-wide competence, in the sense that we can work and make recommendations across the system to all 28 organizations together, or to a group of them, which is quite unique, because otherwise there are oversight bodies that are only dealing with within one organization. We have this system-wide, so that gives you a sort of impression that if done seriously, our work might be relevant, in the sense that we can make recommendations to improve the current situation in many areas, including the one I'm talking about today, the partnership with the private sector. So what we do is, first of all, to try to have a diagnosis of the current situation in the system, and we found out that indeed the relationship between the United Nations and the private sector has evolved quite substantially in recent decades. One of the let's say landmark event was the creation of this global compact, which is a form of recognition by the private sector of 10 principles dealing with human rights, labor standards, environmental protection, and anti-corruption. So it was, let's say, the first attempt to marry the values and the principle of the United Nations with the let's say, allow me, some of you represent the private sector, the selfishness, the profit-seeking main feature of the private sector. We try to attract the private sector in service of these values. And I think that to some extent the experience of Global Compact was a successful one, and also the notion of corporate social responsibility has developed quite spectacularly. And there are numerous serious businesses and global players that do consider that corporate social responsibility it should be part of their daily work. Now with the agenda, it's obvious that there are more ways for the private sector to get involved in the implementation of the agenda. And it's not just financing and participating in the execution of some projects, but it is also, and probably more importantly, the effort done by the private companies to consider sustainability as part of their business model, and to what extent we can together demonstrate that sustainability is also it's a common platform on which both entities could work. It remains to be seen. So now on a more modest scale, which is the report of the Joint Inspection Unit, which will soon be publicly available. And indeed, as Alam said, it is the first time I had the opportunity to share with a public some of the recommendations of our report. It is our attempt to demonstrate first of all, to get ourselves, the United Nations system, more attractive to the private sector as a partner, and to demonstrate that the overall ambition of the 2030 agenda to transform the world should start by the transformation of our own norms and rules and procedures. And we are proposing, I won't get into details, probably I'll give you a few examples. We're trying first of all to transform, or at least to, in relation with the private sector, to find a way to have more flexible administrative and financial rules, because our rules were accumulated in the sense that we are using the public money, the money, the contributions of the member states, and we have to be responsible. So you can imagine that in over 70 years of such work with the money of the member states, we had quite a number of rules and regulations that were required, imposed onto the organization by member states, but they sometimes may not work as efficiently as needed in relation to the private sector. So one of the calls in our report was indeed to have a reconsideration of the way we are working with the private sector, without for that abandoning the rules that we have to observe in relations with the money coming from the member states. But we have to make ourselves more flexible and responsive body in relation to the private sector. So this is one of the things. And then in terms of what we have to continue to protect, and that is our values and principles as a global organizations, we are trying to revisit a little bit the interpretation that we gave in 1946 to the use of the logos and emblems of the United Nations. That is something that we have to stick in protecting our values, but at the same time, the world in 2018 is completely different of the world in 1945, 1946. So we have to reconsider, to see and to expand a little bit the area of common interest and more flexible interpretation of the existing rules. We are also proposing more support to the small and medium enterprises. After all, we are all used to see on the headlines only the biggest companies, the major players, ignoring that actually the vast part of the world product is produced by small and medium enterprises. It's not produced by these global players that we are all afraid of, and we look at them as being key actors. We do not deny that they are key actors, but we should remember that actually it is the multitude, the millions of small and medium enterprises that actually bring the most important contribution to development. And they should know, and they should be helped to understand and to work for the United Nations agenda. And there is also another advantage. These young companies, they came into existence at the point where the understanding of the global ethics is more present than in other time, in the sense that they will know what does it mean to protect the environment. They will know what does it mean to exploit or not to exploit the children. They will have more global awareness of the global public goods than other companies in the past. So in other words, they might start of not having bad habits that have been developed in hundreds probably of economic activities, and they should come with a new model of development. And then it is also the new era of a new attitude by the consumers. The consumers' attitude is important on the market, so we shouldn't we should indeed educate the consumers, and that is also to be done by using the new energy and dynamics of the small and medium enterprises. We are also considering the development of innovation partnerships, and we made a recommendation in that respect, in particular at system-wide level. Innovation, it's something that is on the agenda of many organizations in the system, including UNICEF, but we continue to try to do it in the same way as in the past, that is in isolation, working in silos, where in that respect we need to have more coordination and more interagency cooperation. This might not be something that you are very sensible about, but for us as Joint Inspection Unit, as I said, we are a system-wide body. We try to, in particular, to put some emphasis on coordination, because to the global problems that are now we are confronted with, we cannot continue to act individually, despite the specialization that many of the organizations have it. But for instance, UNICEF, of course, it's obvious what is the main area of activity, but at the same time, who can dissociate the work on children from the work on education done by UNESCO, the work on refugees done by the UNHCR, the work on development done by UNDP, the work on population planning and other kind of work done by UNFPA, and the examples could go on. And actually all the sustainable development goals are formulated in a way that made explicit the need for more interagency and more coordination at the level of the system-wide. And also, as I said, we try to make the UN system more user-friendly for the private sector. For many of the businesses, they do not know exactly our intricacies, the complexity of our system. When they say United Nations, they mean United Nations, that global organization headquarters in New York. Or that is much more. United Nations is much more and much more complex, and it should act to the extent possible in a really united way in relation to the new sustainable development goals. Let's say if you'll have the curiosity to see the report, you will see that also that we are trying to develop new forms of cooperation at a regional level and at national level. I won't insist on the regional level, although I understand that the World Association for Sustainable Development is doing this kind of regional meetings with the special emphasis with the specificity of various regions in the world. But the very presence of our presence today in the UNICEF house allows me to make a reference to one of the important recommendations that we are making, and that is about the work that is to be done at the national level. It is a statement, a political statement by the agenda that this agenda is not the responsibility of the United Nations, it's mainly the responsibility of member states. The United Nations is a facilitator, is a catalyst of the international effort. So the main responsibility would fall within the governments and its partners at national level. And we have been somehow criticized by some actors from the civil society in the sense that we are using the word partnership with some easiness, in the sense that it is not partnership if the actors are not actually perfectly equal. And that is true. We are an intergovernmental organizations. The private sector cannot be involved as such in the decision making at the headquarters level. You will see in our report, we recommended the sort of business advisory council role at regional level, because by all means the regional level brings together countries that might have similar problems, and then might have problems that cannot be solved otherwise that within a regional context. So the place where we actually could work with the private sector on equal footing is at the national level, and that is because at the national level we can change the philosophy. The traditional philosophy was I am the United Nations, I have a project, I need your help. Can you help us with money? Can you help us with expertise, etc.? What we are suggesting is a new model, one in which the United Nations is defining the problem. We have a problem. Let us solve that problem together. Let us, and obviously, in many respects, the private sector might be more competent, more apt to bring innovation and solve some problems than the governments as such, or as the United Nations. So we are proposing, there is a very specific recommendations and done that at national level, the agencies and the funds and programs of the United Nations that do have a presence in the field, they engage into a really involvement of the private sector from the very beginning of any kind of activities on really equal footing, and that is nothing to contradict rather the current governance structure of the United Nations, nor the purposes of the agenda for sustainable development, or the interest of the governments, because the government should be also present in this multi-stakeholder formula of discussion over the discussion on how to solve some problems. And the fact that we are talking here about Sudan and diaspora, the Sudanese diaspora, I think you might all be in a position to visualize what kind of effort that might be at the national level. But I'm a little bit, I have this pleasant surprise to see the emphasis on the role of diaspora in development. I confess it might be my ignorance, although the United Nations statistics confirm quite heavily that the remittances of the diaspora are sometimes very important, crucially important for the development of the country, or for that matter, for the survival of some countries in a situation of conflict. But I'm afraid, I might be wrong, but I'm afraid that we never actually conceptualize that much this issue, and for that reason I really congratulate you, Professor Ahmed, for this idea and for the inclusion of the role of diaspora among the topics to be discussed at the conference that we are planning to organize in Geneva with this with your association. Obviously, there are other important recommendations. I don't want to take your time. I might be ready to respond to questions if you wish, but one last word about this conference. We do not have in GIU, the Joint Inspection Unit don't have as a mandate to organize conferences and to do much more than the production of our reports and the follow-up on those recommendations. But we were inspired by the overall objectives of the agenda and on the spirit of our report to organize this conference in partnership with the World Association for Sustainable Development, just to show that it is very easy to find a common background and to find common interest, and to have a win-win situation in which both the United Nations, or for that matter Joint Inspection Unit, and the World Association for Sustainable Development will have to make out of this conference. And this conference should be a conference among practitioners. It won't be a conference on intentions. It will be a conference among professional practitioner people that are operational, and they have ideas in how to serve the 2030 agenda. I'm sorry if I took too much time, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Petru. I forget to welcome those who are following us on live. And although we encourage people to use English, but if there's any Arabic, don't worry. We have Dr. If there's any question from the streaming in English, or if it's Arabic, ask. Do you have any? They're all in Arabic.
As many questions, just a lot of thank yous for sharing this information.
Okay, so there's no specific one you want to address to Petru. The Arabic one, right?
No, there hasn't been any.
Okay. Just before we go to, thank you very much, Petru. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. I think we're going to have the discussion at the end. It's just whenever we finish one talk, we will give chance to any live streaming question before they forget it. So we will, unfortunately, we have to bring you back again and discuss. Thank you very much, Petru. Thank you. One thing Petru mentioned about the remittance of the diaspora, in our last conference in 2017, we had Professor Rahul from University of California. The University of California is conducting a huge project on the diaspora and the remittance. And he gave a very strong statement in his outcome of their research in California. They said the GDP, the gross domestic product of those diaspora worldwide at California research, it found to be 1/3 of the global GDP. And that was a staggering figure, but it's a university, we respect, it's a huge research. 1/3 of the global GDP, imagine the whole world GDP, 1/3 is diaspora. So some of you guys here are contributing massively.